The goblet slipped from Lauren's fingers and shattered against the marble floor, and the sound cut through the pack hall like a blade. She staggered, one hand pressed to her throat, her breath coming in short, theatrical gasps. Every wolf in the room turned toward her at once, chairs scraping back, voices rising in alarm. "Poison," she whispered, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "She poisoned me." Her finger, trembling and pale, pointed straight across the room at Soraya. Soraya felt the air leave her lungs. She had been standing quietly near the fireplace, a cup of untouched wine in her own hand, watching the celebration from the edge of the room, the way she always did. She had not gone near Lauren's goblet. She had not gone near Lauren at all that evening. But none of that seemed to matter now, because 60 pairs of eyes had already decided her guilt before she could open her mouth. "That is not true," Soraya said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. "I never touched her wine." Lauren's knees buckled, and 2 of the pack's guards rushed to catch her before she fell. Her face had gone pale, her lips trembling, and for a moment, even Soraya wondered if something was truly wrong with her. But the timing was too perfect, too neat, like a scene rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. Damon rose from his seat at the head of the hall. As Alpha, his presence alone could silence a room, and it did now. He did not look at Soraya first. He did not ask her a single question. His eyes went straight to Lauren, gentle and full of worry, the same way they always did. "Get the healer," he ordered. "Now." The healer arrived within moments, a thin, sharp-eyed woman named Ivy, who knelt beside Lauren and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. The hall had gone utterly silent, waiting. "Her pulse is racing," Ivy said, "but I need to examine the wine before I can say what caused it." "There is no need," Lauren gasped, clutching Damon's sleeve as he crouched beside her. "I saw her. I saw Soraya near my cup before the toast. She smiled at me and walked away, and only minutes later I felt the burning in my throat." It was a lie, and Soraya knew it was a lie, but the accusation had already done its damage. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Pack members who had known Soraya for years, who had eaten beside her, trained beside her, some who even owed her favors, now looked at her as though she were a stranger who had wandered in from the forest with blood on her hands. "Damon," Soraya said, stepping forward, "you know me. You know I would never do such a thing." For one brief moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been doubt or memory, or the ghost of the trust they once shared, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the weight of Lauren's soft crying and the fear in the room. "Take her to the cells," Damon said. His voice was flat, final, the voice of an alpha making a decision rather than a mate defending someone he loved. "Until we know the truth, she will not walk free among the pack." 2 guards moved toward Soraya. She recognized both of them, young wolves who had trained under her guidance only a few years earlier, who had once looked to her with respect. Now their eyes were lowered, unwilling to meet hers, as if her innocence or guilt no longer mattered, only the order they had been given. "I have done nothing wrong," Soraya said again, louder this time, so that every wolf in the hall could hear her clearly. "I will not run from this, but someone in this room is lying, and it is not me." Lauren's eyes, just for an instant, sharpened with something cold and satisfied, before softening again into practiced distress. It was so brief that only Soraya seemed to notice it, a flash of triumph hidden beneath layers of performance. No one else was looking closely enough. No one else wanted to. The guards took her by the arms, not roughly, but firmly enough that she understood there would be no arguing her way free. As they led her from the hall, she looked back once at Damon, hoping to find some trace of the wolf, who had once promised to stand beside her no matter what storm came. He was still crouched beside Lauren, murmuring soft words of comfort, his hand resting on her shoulder, the way it used to rest on Soraya's. The cold night air outside the hall did nothing to calm the storm building inside her chest. The pack's holding cells were built into the side of the mountain, carved from stone, centuries ago for wolves who had broken the deepest laws of their kind. Soraya had walked past them 100 times without a second thought. She had never imagined she would be the one led through their iron gate. Inside her wolf, Freya stirred restlessly, pacing the edges of her mind like a caged animal, sensing danger long before it arrived. "Something is wrong," Freya said, her voice low and urgent. "This is not right. I do not smell poison on you. I never smelled it on her either." Saraya held on to that thought as the guards guided her down the narrow stone steps. Freya's senses were never wrong. A wolf's nose could catch the faintest trace of anything unusual. Blood, sickness, fear, deceit. If there truly had been poison, Freya would have caught its scent the moment Lauren collapsed. Instead, all Freya had caught was the sharp, bitter smell of Lauren's own perfume, thick enough to mask almost anything beneath it. The cell they placed her in was small, with a single narrow window near the ceiling that let in a sliver of moonlight. The guards said nothing as they closed the door behind her, the heavy lock clicking into place with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Saraya sank onto the cold stone bench along the wall and pressed her palms against her eyes. She thought of every gift Damon had given Lauren over the past year: the silk gowns, the jeweled hairpins, the private dinners in his study, while Saraya sat alone in the Luna's chambers, wondering why her own mate no longer sought her company. She thought of every time she had swallowed her pride and said nothing, believing that patience and loyalty would eventually be rewarded, that Damon would remember the vows they made beneath the old oak tree on the night of their bonding. She had been wrong. Loyalty, it seemed, meant nothing if it was not loud enough to compete with tears and trembling hands. Somewhere above her, through the thick stone walls, she could still hear the faint murmur of the pack hall, voices rising and falling, the celebration continuing without her, as though she had simply vanished from its memory. She wondered how long it would take before the truth surfaced, if it ever would at all. Wolves were creatures of instinct and scent, bound by senses no human trick could fool, yet even wolves could be blinded when fear and heartbreak clouded their judgment. Freya pressed closer to the surface of her thoughts, steady and calm despite everything. "We did nothing wrong," she said again. "The truth has a scent too, and it does not fade so easily. Someone will catch it eventually." Saraya wanted to believe her. And she needed to believe her, because the alternative, that she would spend the rest of her life imprisoned for a crime she never committed while Lauren rose to take her place beside Damon, was more than she could bear to imagine. Footsteps echoed down the stone corridor outside her cell, slow and deliberate. She lifted her head, expecting to see a guard bringing water or bread, but instead found herself looking into the sharp, pale eyes of old Garrick, one of the pack's most respected trackers, a wolf so skilled in scent work that even the elders consulted him in matters no one else could solve. He said nothing at first, simply studied her through the bars with the quiet patience of a wolf who had spent decades reading truths that words could never fully capture. Then he leaned closer, inhaling slowly, deliberately, the way trackers did when searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "You do not carry the scent of guilt," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I have smelled guilt before. It clings to a person like smoke. You carry only fear, and confusion, and something else." "What else?" Saraya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrick's eyes narrowed slightly, thoughtful. "Betrayal," he said, "but not the kind you have been accused of, the kind that has been done to you." Before she could ask him anything further, another set of footsteps approached, faster and heavier, and Garrick straightened immediately, his expression shifting back into careful neutrality. A guard rounded the corner, glancing between the tracker and the prisoner with mild suspicion. "Elder Corbin wants to see you," the guard said to Garrick, "about the wine goblets." Garrick nodded once, his gaze lingering on Saraya for a heartbeat longer, before he turned and followed the guard back up the stone steps. Saraya sat in the silence that followed, turning his words over in her mind again and again. The wine goblets. If the elders were already looking into the goblets themselves, then perhaps the truth was not as buried as she feared. She thought of Lauren's face in that final unguarded second before the doors of the hall closed behind her, that flicker of cold satisfaction hidden beneath false tears. Whatever game Lauren was playing, she had clearly expected to win it quickly and quietly, with Saraya locked away and forgotten before anyone thought to ask the right questions. But wolves were not so easily fooled forever. Scent did not lie, even when voices did, and somewhere above her, in the corridors of power she could no longer walk freely, the first threads of truth were already beginning to unravel. Saraya leaned her head back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to steady the frantic beating of her heart. Whatever came next, she would not break. She had built her place in this pack through years of loyalty and sacrifice, and she refused to let one carefully staged performance erase all of it in a single night. Freya settled quietly within her, a steady presence in the darkness. "Hold on," she said. "The wolves of this pack have sharper senses than any lie can survive. Someone will find the truth. We only have to wait for the right nose to catch the right scent." Outside, the moon climbed higher over the mountain, casting pale light through the narrow window of her cell, and somewhere far above, in the warmth of the hall, Lauren allowed herself a private, satisfied smile that no one else was awake to see. Morning came slowly to the cells beneath the mountain, the light filtering through the narrow window in thin gray strips, long before the sun ever cleared the ridge. Soraya had not slept. She had spent the night replaying every detail of the previous evening, searching for something she might have missed, some clue that would explain why Lauren had chosen that particular moment, that particular lie, to destroy her. A tray of bread and water was pushed through a slot in the door without a word. She did not touch it at first, her stomach twisted too tightly with worry to consider food. Instead, she sat with her back against the wall, listening to the faint sounds of the pack moving above her, footsteps, distant voices, the ordinary rhythm of a day beginning as though nothing had changed. For her, everything had changed. She thought of the years she had spent as Luna, standing quietly beside Damon during council meetings, settling disputes between pack families, tending to the sick when the healers were overwhelmed, training the younger wolves in combat and discipline. She had never asked for praise. She had never demanded gifts or attention. She had simply done what needed to be done, believing that steady devotion mattered more than loud declarations of love. Somewhere along the way, Damon had stopped noticing. It had started small, a missed dinner here, a shortened conversation there, until eventually entire weeks passed, where he barely looked at her at all. Lauren had arrived not long after, sent by a neighboring pack as part of a trade agreement, and within months, she had become a permanent fixture in Damon's private study, her laughter drifting down the hallway at hours, when Soraya lay alone in the Luna's chambers. Soraya had told herself it meant nothing. Alphas sometimes kept companions, and pack tradition did not forbid it, though it was rarely spoken of openly. But she had not expected companionship to turn into replacement, nor had she expected that replacement to come wrapped in false tears and a well-timed accusation. The sound of the outer door opening pulled her from her thoughts. She rose to her feet as footsteps approached, and to her surprise, it was not a guard who appeared at the bars but Nora, one of the few pack members who had remained close to her over the years, a beta-ranked wolf with sharp instincts and an even sharper tongue. "I only have a few minutes," Nora whispered, glancing back over her shoulder toward the stairs. "The guards think I am bringing extra bread." "You should not be here," Soraya said, though relief flooded through her at the sight of a familiar face. "If Damon finds out?" "Damon is too busy fussing over Lauren to notice anything else right now," Nora said, bitterness sharp in her voice. "She has convinced half the pack she is at death's door, though I heard from Ivy that her symptoms cleared up remarkably fast once she was moved to the Alpha's private chambers." Soraya's eyes narrowed. "How fast?" "Within an hour," Nora said. "Ivy examined her again this morning, and found nothing wrong with her at all. No lingering weakness, no damage to her throat, nothing that would suggest actual poison had touched her lips." Hope flickered cautiously in Soraya's chest, though she was careful not to let it grow too quickly. "Did Ivy report this to the elders?" "She tried," Nora said, her frustration evident. "But Damon dismissed it, said perhaps her strength as a wolf helped her recover quickly. He does not want to hear anything that casts doubt on Lauren's story. It is as though he needs her to be innocent, and you to be guilty, because the alternative is too difficult for him to face." Soraya closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that truth. It was not simply that Damon believed Lauren over her, it was that he wanted to believe her, because believing otherwise would mean confronting everything he had allowed himself to become over the past year, distant, careless, blind to the wolf who had stood loyally beside him for so long. "There is something else," Nora continued, lowering her voice even further. "Old Garrick was seen near the kitchens late last night, examining the goblets that were used during the celebration. He did not report anything to Damon, He went straight to Elder Corbin instead. I spoke with him, Soraya said. He came to my cell before he went to the elders. He said I did not carry the scent of guilt. Nora's expression brightened slightly. If Garrick is involved, then this will not be buried so easily. He has never been wrong in matters of scent, not once in all his years as tracker. Even the elders trust his nose over half the testimonies given in this pack. Before Soraya could respond, the sound of boots on stone echoed from the stairwell above, and Nora straightened quickly, stepping back from the bars with practiced ease. I have to go, she whispered. Stay strong. This is not over, Soraya. I promise you that. She disappeared up the steps just as a guard rounded the corner, glancing suspiciously at the empty corridor, before continuing on his rounds without comment. Soraya sat back down slowly, turning the new information over in her mind. If Lauren had truly recovered within an hour, with no lasting symptoms of any kind, then whatever she had claimed to swallow had likely never touched her at all. It was, she realized, precisely the kind of mistake a liar might make when crafting a story in haste, focusing so completely on the accusation itself that the smaller details, the ones that mattered most to a healer's trained eye, were left unconsidered. Freya stirred within her, restless and alert. She miscalculated, Freya said. She thought fear and tears would be enough to convince everyone, and for most of the pack it was. But healers do not lie, and neither do bodies. If there was no poison, there will be no lasting proof of poison, no matter how convincingly she performs her suffering. Soraya allowed herself a small measure of comfort in that thought, though she knew better than to assume the battle was already won. Lauren was clever, calculating in a way that suggested this was not the first time she had bent truth to serve her own ambitions. If her story began to crumble, she would not simply stand by and let it happen. She would adapt, twist the narrative further, find some new way to shift blame and suspicion back onto Soraya before anyone had the chance to question her too closely. The day passed slowly, marked only by the occasional shuffle of guards changing shifts and the faint smell of food drifting down from the kitchens above. No one else came to see her. She wondered whether Damon had given orders forbidding visitors, or whether the rest of the pack simply preferred to stay away from a situation that felt too dangerous to involve themselves in. As evening settled over the mountain, the temperature in the cell dropped sharply, and Soraya wrapped her arms around herself, grateful at least for the thick fur cloak she had been wearing the previous night, one of the few possessions the guards had allowed her to keep. It was during this quiet, cold stretch of evening that she heard voices drifting faintly from somewhere above, carried down through the stone in fragments too broken to fully understand. She rose and pressed herself close to the small window near the ceiling, straining to catch more. Cannot keep denying the healer's findings forever, one voice said, low and urgent. Elder Corbin wants a formal inquiry before the next full moon, said another. Soraya's pulse quickened. A formal inquiry meant the elders were not content to let the matter rest on Lauren's word alone, regardless of how much Damon wished to protect her from scrutiny. If Corbin was pushing for a proper investigation, then perhaps the balance of power within the pack was shifting, however slowly, toward the truth. She thought of old Garrick's steady, knowing eyes, and the strange certainty in his voice when he told her she did not carry the scent of guilt. Trackers like him did not offer such statements lightly. If he had already begun gathering evidence from the goblets, then somewhere among the shattered pieces of glass and spilled wine lay the beginning of an answer that no amount of tears or performance could erase. Freya settled quietly within her once more, patient and watchful. The wolves of this pack are not fools, she said. They may be slow, and some may be blind out of fear or loyalty, but they are not fools. Truth has a way of surfacing among creatures who trust their senses more than their emotions. Soraya held on to those words as the night deepened around her, the cold stone walls pressing close on every side. She did not know how long the inquiry would take, or what new obstacles Lauren might place in its path before it could reach its conclusion. But for the first time since the goblet shattered against the marble floor, she allowed herself to believe, cautiously, quietly, that the truth was not lost forever. It was only beginning to stir. Elder Corbin's chambers sat at the highest point of the pack's stone hall, a round room lined with old tapestries depicting wolves from generations long past. It was here, on the third morning after the accusation, that Ivy the healer stood before the gathered elders, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her expression carefully composed despite the tension in the room. "I have examined Lauren 3 times now," she said. "On the night of the incident, the following morning, and again yesterday evening. Each time, I have found nothing consistent with poisoning of any kind." Elder Corbin, a broad-shouldered wolf whose fur had long since turned silver with age, leaned forward in his seat. "Explain what you mean by nothing consistent." "True poisoning leaves traces," Ivy said. "Discoloration of the tongue, irregularities in the pulse that persist for days, sometimes weakness in the limbs depending on the substance used. Lauren showed none of these signs beyond the first hour. Her recovery was immediate and complete, which is simply not possible if she had truly ingested anything harmful strong enough to cause the reaction she displayed in the hall." A murmur passed through the small gathering of elders. Elder Winifred, a sharp-eyed woman known for her careful, measured judgments, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Are you suggesting she was never poisoned at all?" "I am suggesting," Ivy said carefully, "that whatever happened to her that night, it does not match the symptoms of poisoning, despite what she has claimed." Damon, who had been standing silently near the window with his arms crossed, finally spoke. "Perhaps her wolf nature allowed her to heal faster than a human body would." "I considered that," Ivy said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But even wolves show some residual signs after exposure to true poison. There would be some trace, however faint. I found none." The room fell quiet again, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Damon's jaw tightened, and Soraya, had she been there to see it, would have recognized the same expression he used to wear whenever a difficult truth threatened to disrupt the story he had built in his mind. It was at that moment that old Garrick stepped forward from the shadows near the doorway, where he had been standing quietly through the entire exchange, waiting for the right moment to speak. "I have something to add," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room despite its quiet tone. Elder Corbin nodded for him to continue. "On the night of the celebration, I collected the goblets used at the high table before they could be cleared away by the kitchen staff," Garrick said. "I examined each one carefully. Soraya's goblet carried only the scent of the wine itself, nothing more. Lauren's goblet, however, carried a faint trace of something else beneath the wine, something sharp and bitter, similar to a certain root used in minor sedatives among neighboring packs, but far too diluted to cause any true harm." Elder Winifred's eyes narrowed. "A sedative, not a poison." "Precisely," Garrick said. "Enough to cause dizziness, a racing heart, perhaps even a brief burning sensation in the throat if taken undiluted, but nothing that would leave lasting damage. It would produce exactly the kind of dramatic reaction Lauren displayed that night, and then fade completely within an hour, exactly as Ivy has described." The implications of his words settled slowly over the room. If Lauren had ingested a mild sedative rather than a true poison, and if her symptoms matched that substance perfectly rather than anything more dangerous, then the possibility that she had staged the entire scene became difficult to ignore. "You are suggesting," Elder Corbin said slowly, "that Lauren poisoned herself, deliberately, in order to place blame on Soraya." "I am suggesting the evidence points in that direction," Garrick said carefully. "I make no claims beyond what my senses have told me. But scent does not lie, and the scent on that goblet does not match the story we were told." Damon's expression had shifted from tense to something closer to disbelief, though whether it stemmed from doubt in Garrick's findings, or the beginning of a much harder doubt about Lauren herself, it was impossible to say. "This is a serious accusation," Damon said, his voice tighter than usual. "Lauren is not a wolf trained in the use of sedatives or poisons. Where would she have obtained such a substance?" "That," Garrick said, "is a question I cannot answer through scent alone, but it is a question worth asking." Elder Corbin rose from his seat, his decision made with the calm authority that had guided the Pack's counsel for decades. "We cannot proceed on assumption alone, but neither can we ignore evidence presented by our most trusted tracker and confirmed by our healer's independent findings. I am calling for a formal inquiry to be held before the full Pack, where all evidence will be presented and questioned openly. Soraya will be permitted to speak in her own defense, and Lauren will be required to answer for the inconsistencies in her account." Damon's hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing to object. Even he could not argue against the will of the elders once it had been formally declared, not without appearing to protect Lauren at the expense of justice itself, something he could not afford to be seen doing in front of the entire pack. The inquiry will take place in 3 days' time, Elder Corbin announced. That will give us time to gather any additional evidence and allow Saria the opportunity to prepare her defense. As the meeting drew to a close and the elders began filing out of the chamber, Garrick lingered behind, watching Damon closely. When the room had emptied enough that only the two of them remained, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, meant for Damon alone. "You have known Saria for many years," Garrick said, "longer than you have known Lauren. Ask yourself honestly, which of them has ever given you reason to doubt their word before now?" Damon did not answer immediately. He stared out the window toward the mountains beyond, his expression unreadable. "Saria has never lied to me," he said finally, his voice low. "Then perhaps," Garrick said, turning to leave, "it is worth considering why you were so quick to believe she had started now." He left Damon alone with his thoughts, the words settling heavily in the empty chamber. Below, in the cold stone cell that had become her temporary world, Saria had no way of knowing what had just transpired above her, no way of knowing that the first crack had finally appeared in the story built so carefully against her. But somewhere deep within her, Freya stirred with a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with instinct. "Something has shifted," Freya whispered. "I can feel it, even from here. The truth is beginning to move." Saria, sitting alone in the fading afternoon light, did not know why hope suddenly pressed against her chest, warm and unexpected after days of cold uncertainty. But she welcomed it all the same, holding on to the feeling as though it were the first real proof, however small, that the world had not entirely turned against her. Above, in her private chambers, Lauren paced restlessly across the floor, her earlier calm replaced by a growing unease she could not quite name. She had not expected Garrick to examine the goblet so quickly, nor had she expected Ivy's persistence in questioning her recovery. She had planned everything carefully, every tear, every trembling word, but she had not planned for wolves whose senses reached further than her performance could hide. For the first time since the night of the celebration, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her face, quickly hidden the moment a servant entered the room. But it lingered in the air long after the servant had gone, faint and bitter, the same way certain scents lingered on goblets no matter how carefully they were cleaned. News of the formal inquiry spread through the pack within hours, carried from house to house in hushed, urgent whispers. By evening, nearly everyone knew that old Garrick had found something suspicious on Lauren's goblet, and that Ivy the healer had questioned the very foundation of her story. Opinions within the pack, once united in sympathy for the trembling woman who had collapsed at the celebration, began to splinter into uncertain, uneasy factions. Lauren felt the shift immediately. Where once servants had rushed to bring her warm broth and soft blankets, now their eyes lingered a moment too long before they looked away, their movements slightly more hesitant, their words slightly more careful. She noticed the way conversations quieted whenever she entered a room, the way glances passed between pack members that she was clearly not meant to see. She needed to move quickly, before the inquiry gave the elders too much time to dig further into the truth she had worked so hard to bury. That evening, she summoned her personal maid, a quiet, nervous young woman named Maggie, who had served her since her arrival in the pack months earlier. Maggie had always been easy to control, grateful for steady work and a warm place to sleep, willing to overlook small oddities in exchange for security. But even Maggie had heard the rumors circulating through the servants' quarters, and her hands trembled slightly as she entered Lauren's chambers. "You wanted to see me, my lady?" Maggie asked, keeping her eyes lowered. "Close the door," Lauren said. Maggie obeyed, though her nervousness only seemed to grow once the door clicked shut behind her, sealing the two of them alone in the dim candlelight. "I need you to remember something clearly," Lauren said, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace. "If anyone asks you about the night of the celebration, you will say that you saw Saria near my private quarters earlier that evening, going through my belongings." Maggie's eyes widened slightly. "But my lady, I never saw." "You will say you saw it," Lauren interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through Maggie's hesitation. "It does not matter what you actually saw. It matters what you say you saw." Maggie's throat tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing, staring at the floor as though the answer might be written somewhere in the old wooden planks beneath her feet. "My lady," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "if this goes before the elders, and I am asked to swear to something untrue, and it is later discovered—" "It will not be discovered," Lauren said firmly, though a flicker of something uncertain passed briefly across her features. "You simply need to say what I have told you, nothing more." "And if I refuse?" Maggie asked, surprising even herself with the boldness of the question. Lauren's expression hardened instantly, all warmth vanishing from her face. "Then you will find yourself without a place in this pack, or any pack. Once I explain to Damon how unreliable and disloyal his mistress's own maid has become. Do you understand what that would mean for you, alone, with no family here, no protection?" Maggie lowered her eyes again, the threat landing exactly as intended. "I understand," she whispered. "Good," Lauren said, her composure returning as quickly as it had cracked. "You may go." Maggie left the room quickly, her heart pounding, her hands still trembling as she made her way down the narrow servants' corridor toward the kitchens. She did not go directly to her sleeping quarters that night. Instead, she wandered restlessly through the lower halls of the pack house, unable to settle her thoughts, the weight of what she had just been asked to do pressing heavily against her chest. It was near the kitchens that she encountered Nora, who was retrieving a late meal for herself after a long day spent quietly gathering information on Saria's behalf. Nora noticed immediately that something was wrong, the way Maggie's hands shook slightly as she reached for a cup of water, the way her eyes refused to meet anyone's gaze. "Are you well?" Nora asked carefully, keeping her voice gentle. Maggie startled, nearly dropping the cup. "I am fine," she said quickly, though the words came out unconvincing even to her own ears. Nora studied her for a long moment, sensing the tension radiating from the younger woman. She had learned over the years that fear often hid truths far more valuable than confidence ever could, and something about Maggie's frightened posture told her there was more beneath the surface than a simple bad day. "You served Lauren tonight," Nora said. "Not quite a question." Maggie's face paled further. "I should return to my quarters," she said, setting down the cup and turning to leave. "Maggie," Nora said quietly, stepping slightly to block her path, though not aggressively, simply enough to hold her attention for one more moment. "Whatever she has asked of you, you do not have to carry it alone. If something is wrong, if you have seen something, or been asked to say something you know is untrue, there are people in this pack who would protect you if you came forward." For a brief, fragile second, something in Maggie's expression cracked. Her eyes filling with tears, she quickly blinked away. "I cannot," she whispered. "She said she would ruin me. I have no family here. I have nowhere else to go if I lose my place in this pack." "The elders do not punish those who tell the truth," Nora said gently. "Especially not when that truth helps them uncover a greater wrong." Maggie shook her head quickly, stepping back. "Please, do not ask me anything further. I cannot risk it. I am sorry." She hurried away, before Nora could say anything else, disappearing down the corridor toward the servants' quarters, leaving Nora standing alone with her unfinished meal, and a growing certainty that something far more troubling than a simple accident had taken place on the night of the celebration. Nora did not waste any time. As soon as she was certain no one else was watching, she made her way toward Elder Corbin's chambers, her mind racing through everything she had just witnessed. The elder was still awake, reviewing notes from the earlier meeting by candlelight, and he looked up with mild surprise as Nora entered without waiting to be formally announced. "I apologize for the late hour," Nora said, "but I believe there is something you should know." She recounted everything, Maggie's trembling hands, her refusal to make eye contact, the fear so plainly written across her face, the way she had nearly confessed something before catching herself and retreating into silence. Elder Corbin listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "It is not proof," he said once she had finished, "but it is enough to warrant closer attention. Fear like that does not come from nothing." "What will you do?" Nora asked. "I will ensure Maggie is present at the formal inquiry," Corbin said. "Sometimes Standing before the entire pack, under the weight of the elders' questions, a person finds it far harder to hold on to a lie than they do in the privacy of a servant's corridor. Nora nodded, though worry still lingered in her chest for the frightened young maid who had clearly been caught between fear and conscience. As she left the elders' chambers and made her way back through the quiet halls of the pack house, she thought of Soraya, still locked away in the cold cell beneath the mountain, unaware that the walls of Lauren's carefully constructed lie had just begun to show their first true cracks, thin and fragile, but cracks nonetheless. Somewhere above the cells, Lauren slept soundly that night, confident that her threats had secured Maggie's silence, unaware that fear, once planted too deeply, often grew into something far more dangerous than the obedience it was meant to produce. The days leading up to the formal inquiry passed slowly for Soraya, each one blending into the next within the confines of her stone cell. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the guards' rounds, the faint sounds of the pack going about its daily life far above her, and the quiet company of her own thoughts, which she had learned to guide carefully away from despair and toward something closer to resolve. She thought often of the night she had saved Damon's life, 3 years earlier, during a border skirmish with a rival pack that had turned far more violent than anyone anticipated. Damon had been struck down, wounded badly enough that he could not defend himself against the wolf closing in for what would have been a final blow. Soraya had thrown herself between them without hesitation, taking on the fight herself and driving the attacker back long enough for reinforcements to arrive. She still carried a faint scar along her ribs from that night, a reminder of the price she had paid to protect the wolf, who now seemed unable, or unwilling, to extend her the same faith in return. She had never asked for recognition for what she had done. She had never expected gratitude beyond the quiet understanding that existed between mates who trusted one another completely. But sitting alone in her cell now, she wondered whether that trust had ever truly existed on his side, or whether it had simply been a story she told herself, because the alternative was too painful to accept. Freya remained close throughout those long, quiet hours, offering steady comfort even when words felt insufficient. "You saved him because it was right," Freya said one evening, as the last light faded from the narrow window above. "Not because you expected anything in return. Do not let his failure to remember that diminish what you know to be true about yourself." Soraya held on to those words, letting them settle into the hollow places left by days of isolation and doubt. She refused to let her circumstances shrink her sense of who she was, refused to let fear turn her bitter or desperate in the eyes of those who might still be watching, waiting to see how she carried herself under pressure. Word reached her through Nora, who managed a second brief visit 2 days before the inquiry, that sentiment within the pack had begun shifting in her favor. Warriors who had trained under her leadership spoke quietly among themselves about her steady character, her years of quiet service, the countless small kindnesses she had shown throughout her time as Luna. Even those who had never been especially close to her found themselves questioning why an alpha would condemn someone so quickly, without proper evidence, simply because his mistress had wept convincingly enough. "They are talking about you," Nora said, keeping her voice low as she passed a small parcel of bread through the bars. "Not with pity, but with respect. They remember how you carried yourself when Damon was injured, how you never once sought credit for what you did. It is beginning to matter to them now, more than it did before." Soraya allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Respect will not free me from this cell, if the inquiry does not go in my favor." "It might," Nora said. "Elder Corbin does not make decisions lightly, and neither does Garrick. If they believe the evidence points toward the truth, they will not let Damon's feelings for Lauren stand in the way of justice, not when the entire pack is watching so closely." Soraya nodded slowly, grateful for the reassurance, even as uncertainty continued to gnaw quietly at the edges of her composure. She had learned, over the long days of confinement, that hope and fear could occupy the same space within a person, each one refusing to fully surrender to the other, leaving her suspended somewhere uncomfortably in between. On the final night before the inquiry, she found herself unable to sleep, staring up at the small patch of star-filled sky visible through her window. She thought of the vows she and Damon had exchanged beneath the old oak tree, the promises of loyalty and partnership that had once felt as solid and unshakable as the mountain itself. She wondered when exactly those promises had begun to erode, so slowly and quietly that she had not noticed the damage until it was already too deep to easily repair. Perhaps, she thought, it did not matter anymore whether Damon remembered those promises or not. Perhaps what mattered now was simply standing before the pack, before the elders, before Lauren herself, and speaking the truth clearly and without fear, regardless of what judgment followed. She had built her life around quiet dignity and steady service, and she refused to abandon that now, even in the face of injustice. Freya stirred gently within her thoughts as the night deepened around the cell. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Freya said, "we face it together, as we always have. No lie, however well constructed, changes who we truly are." Soraya closed her eyes at last, allowing herself a few hours of restless sleep, her mind quieting just enough to grant her the strength she would need for the trial ahead. Meanwhile, in the warmth of the Alpha's private chambers, Damon sat awake long into the night, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. Garrick's words from days earlier continued to echo through his mind, refusing to fade no matter how firmly he tried to push them aside. "Soraya has never lied to me." He had spoken those words without hesitation, because they were simply true, an undeniable fact, built from years of shared history and mutual respect. And yet he had condemned her within moments of Lauren's accusation, without asking a single question, without pausing even briefly to consider whether the woman who had stood loyally beside him through every hardship deserved at least the benefit of doubt before judgment fell. He thought of the scar along her ribs, hidden now beneath layers of fabric she never spoke of, never used to seek sympathy or attention. He thought of the countless nights she had sat quietly beside him during council meetings, offering steady counsel without ever demanding recognition for her wisdom. He thought, finally, of the warmth that had once existed easily between them, warmth that had cooled so gradually he had convinced himself it simply belonged to a different chapter of their life together, one that had naturally run its course. He was no longer certain that was true. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Lauren entered without waiting for permission, as she often did, settling herself beside him with practiced grace. "You seem troubled," she said, resting a hand gently on his arm. Damon studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for something he could not quite name. "The inquiry begins tomorrow," he said simply. "I know," Lauren said, her voice carrying just the right note of weary resignation. "I only hope the truth is finally recognized, so we can put this unfortunate matter behind us." Something in the careful precision of her words struck him differently than it might have only days earlier, though he could not yet say exactly why. He said nothing further, simply nodding as she settled closer beside him, her presence no longer offering the comfort it once had, replaced instead by a quiet, unfamiliar unease he could not fully explain. Outside, beyond the walls of the pack house, the moon climbed steadily toward its peak, indifferent to the fears and hopes gathered beneath it, patient in the way only time itself could be, waiting for morning to arrive and bring with it the truth that had already begun, slowly and steadily, to make itself known. The great hall had never held so many wolves at once. By the time the sun reached its highest point the following day, every member of the pack old enough to attend had gathered within its stone walls, filling the benches and lining the edges of the room until barely any space remained. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, hushed conversations rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. At the front of the hall, the elders sat in a solemn row behind a long wooden table, Elder Corbin at its center, flanked by Elder Winifred, and two other senior members of the council, whose names carried weight in every serious matter the pack had faced over the decades. Damon sat slightly apart from them, his expression carefully composed, though those who knew him well could see the tension held tightly in his shoulders. Soraya was led into the hall by two guards, her wrists no longer bound, a small gesture of respect the elders had insisted upon despite Damon's earlier orders. She walked with her head held high, refusing to let days of confinement diminish the quiet strength she had carried into every difficult moment of her life. As she took her place before the elders, she allowed herself one brief glance toward the crowd, finding Nora's steady, encouraging gaze among the sea of faces, along with several warriors who offered small, respectful nods, rather than the suspicion she had feared. Lauren entered moments later, dressed in soft, muted colors meant to suggest fragility rather than confidence, her steps slow and careful, as though the events of the past days had left her deeply weakened. She took her place opposite Soraya, close enough that the two women could see each other clearly across the open space between them. Elder Corbin rose to address the gathered pack, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "We are here today to determine the truth behind the accusation made against Soraya on the night of the recent celebration. This inquiry will proceed with testimony from all relevant parties, and evidence will be examined openly, before the entire pack, so that no doubt remains once a judgment is reached." He turned first to Ivy, who stepped forward to repeat her findings clearly, for the benefit of those who had not yet heard them directly. She described Lauren's remarkably swift recovery, the absence of any lasting symptoms consistent with true poisoning, and the significant discrepancy between the dramatic reaction displayed that night and the mild, temporary effects such symptoms would suggest. A murmur passed through the crowd as she spoke, uncertain and uneasy. Lauren's composure flickered slightly, though she quickly steadied herself, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as though she remained entirely unbothered by the healer's testimony. Old Garrick spoke next, presenting his findings regarding the goblets with the same quiet, methodical precision he had shown before the elders days earlier. He described the faint scent detected on Lauren's goblet, the mild sedative properties it suggested, and the complete absence of anything unusual on the goblet Soraya had used throughout the evening. "I make no claims beyond what my senses have confirmed," Garrick said, his voice steady and clear. "But the evidence does not support the story we were originally told." Lauren, when finally given the opportunity to respond, drew herself up with practiced composure, her voice trembling just enough to suggest wounded innocence rather than calculated performance. "I do not understand these accusations against me," she said. "I was the one harmed that night. I collapsed in front of the entire pack. Why would I ever do such a thing to myself?" "That," Elder Corbin said evenly, "is precisely what this inquiry intends to determine." He called forward Maggie next, and the hall fell into a heavier silence as the young maid stepped forward, visibly trembling, her eyes flicking nervously toward Lauren, before dropping to the floor. Nora, watching from among the crowd, felt her chest tighten with worry on the girl's behalf. "You serve Lauren directly," Elder Corbin said gently, his tone far softer than it had been with the other witnesses. "Is there anything you wish to share with this council regarding the night in question, or the days that have followed?" Maggie said nothing at first, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her apron. The silence stretched long enough that several members of the crowd began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the weight pressing down on the frightened young woman. "Maggie," Elder Winifred said, her voice carrying a quiet, steady kindness that seemed to reach through the girl's fear more effectively than authority alone might have. "Whatever you say here will be protected. No harm will come to you for speaking honestly before this council." Maggie's eyes lifted briefly toward Lauren, who stared back at her with an expression that carried no warmth at all, only cold, silent warning. But something in Elder Winifred's steady patience seemed to reach deeper than that warning could, and slowly, painfully, Maggie's composure began to crack. "I was asked," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silent hall, "to say that I saw Soraya going through Lauren's belongings before the celebration, but I never saw that. It never happened." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd, quickly hushed, as Elder Corbin raised a hand for silence. "Who asked you to say this?" he asked, though the answer was already clear to everyone present. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away this time. "Lauren asked me," she said. "She told me if I refused, she would ruin my place in this pack, that I would have nowhere left to go." Lauren's composure shattered instantly, her face draining of color as every eye in the hall turned toward her. "She is lying," Lauren said quickly, her voice rising with sudden panic. "Why would I need to invent false testimony if my own account was already true?" "That," Elder Corbin said, his voice hardening for the first time throughout the entire proceeding, "is an excellent question, and one I suspect you are far more capable of answering than any of us." The hall had grown utterly silent now, every wolf present holding their breath, as the careful architecture of Lauren's story began, piece by piece, to collapse in full view of the entire pack. Elder Corbin allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment, letting the weight of Maggie's confession settle fully over the gathered pack before he spoke again. When he finally did, his voice carried the calm, deliberate authority of a wolf who had presided over difficult matters for many years and understood exactly how to guide a room back from the edge of chaos. "Lauren," he said, "you will have the opportunity to answer these claims fully, but I would remind you that this council has already gathered independent evidence from both our healer and our tracker, neither of whom has any reason to fabricate their findings. The account given by your own maid, under no small amount of personal risk, aligns closely with what that evidence already suggests." Lauren's eyes darted toward Damon, seeking some flicker of support, some sign that he would step in and shield her from the mounting weight of scrutiny pressing down around her. But Damon remained silent, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere between Lauren and the empty space above the crowd, as though he were still working through thoughts too complicated to fully surface. "I do not know why Maggie would say such things," Lauren said, her voice regaining some of its earlier composure, though a thin edge of desperation had crept into it now. Perhaps she was frightened into confusion by this entire process. Perhaps she misunderstood something I said. "I did not misunderstand," Maggie said quietly, surprising even herself with the steadiness that had returned to her voice now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. "You told me exactly what to say, and exactly what would happen to me if I refused." Elder Winifred leaned forward slightly. "Lauren, where did you obtain the substance found on your goblet, the one Garrick identified as consistent with a mild sedative?" Lauren hesitated, her jaw tightening as she searched for an answer that might satisfy the question without incriminating herself further. "I do not know what substance you are referring to," she said finally. "Perhaps it was simply an unusual reaction to the wine itself. The wine served that evening was drawn from the same barrel used throughout the celebration," Elder Corbin said. "No other member of the pack reported any unusual reaction, and Soraya's goblet, filled from the very same source, carried no trace of anything beyond the wine itself. If the substance came from the wine, we would expect to find it more broadly, not isolated entirely to your own cup." The logic of his argument settled heavily over the room, and Lauren's carefully maintained composure began to fray visibly at the edges. Her hands, folded tightly in front of her throughout the proceeding, now trembled slightly, and the color that had drained from her face during Maggie's testimony showed no sign of returning. It was old Garrick who spoke next, stepping forward once more, his quiet presence commanding attention despite his measured tone. "There is one further detail I have not yet shared with this council," he said. "The substance found on Lauren's goblet is not native to our lands. It is drawn from a root that grows only in the territory of the Eastern Pack, several days' journey from here. It is not something easily obtained by accident, nor is it something a member of our own pack would likely possess without deliberate effort to acquire it." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, quickly silenced as Elder Corbin raised his hand once more. "Lauren," he said, his voice firm now, carrying none of the earlier patience he had extended throughout the beginning of the inquiry. "Do you have family or connections within the Eastern Pack?" Lauren's silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own, her eyes fixed on the floor, her earlier confidence entirely gone. When she finally looked up again, something had shifted in her expression, the careful mask of fragility, replaced by something colder, sharper, the same brief flash of calculation Soraya had glimpsed on the night of the celebration, before it vanished behind renewed tears. "My mother's family originates from the Eastern Territories," she admitted quietly. "I have not spoken with them in years, but I still have connections there, yes." "And did one of those connections provide you with the substance found on your goblet?" Elder Winifred asked directly. Lauren said nothing, her silence stretching so long that it became its own confession, more damning than any words could have been. Throughout the entire exchange, Soraya had remained standing quietly before the elders, her expression carefully neutral, refusing to let relief or vindication show too plainly across her face, while the matter remained unresolved. But inside, Freya stirred with growing certainty, warm and steady, the long days of doubt finally beginning to lift, like fog burning away beneath morning sun. "I told you the truth would surface," Freya said quietly. "It only needed the right noses and the right courage to bring it fully into the light. Damon rose slowly from his seat, his expression grave as he studied Lauren for a long moment before turning his gaze toward Soraya for the first time since the inquiry had begun. Something passed between them in that brief exchange, something neither spoke aloud, though the weight of unspoken apology hung heavily in the space between their eyes. "This council will take a brief recess," Elder Corbin announced, "to allow for further private questioning of both Lauren and her maid, before we render our final judgment on this matter." As the guards moved to escort Lauren from the hall for further questioning, her composure finally broke entirely, the tears that had once seemed so convincing, now falling freely and without performance, though few in the hall found themselves moved to sympathy by the change. The crowd watched in heavy silence as she was led away, the truth she had worked so hard to bury, now fully exposed beneath the watchful eyes of the very pack she had hoped to deceive. Soraya remained standing quietly at the front of the hall, her heart still guarded despite the clear turning of events in her favor, unwilling to fully release the tension she had carried for so many days, until the elder's final judgment had been formally spoken. But for the first time since the goblet shattered against the marble floor, she allowed herself to breathe just a little easier, the weight of false accusation finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. The private chamber where Lauren was taken for further questioning was far smaller and colder than the grand hall she had just left, stripped of any comfort that might soften the weight of what was about to unfold. Elder Corbin and Elder Winifred sat across from her, along with Garrick, whose steady presence alone seemed enough to unsettle whatever remaining composure Lauren had managed to gather during the brief walk from the hall. Maggie waited in the corridor outside, her hands still trembling slightly, though Nora had stayed close beside her, offering quiet reassurance that she had done the right thing, that no harm would come to her for speaking honestly before the council. Inside the chamber, Lauren sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, the earlier tears now replaced by a tense, guarded silence. "We can proceed in one of two ways," Elder Corbin said, his tone measured but firm. "You can continue to deny involvement, and this council will pursue further investigation, including formal contact with the Eastern Pack to trace the origin of the substance found on your goblet. Or you can speak honestly now, and allow this matter to be resolved more quickly, with whatever consideration such honesty might earn you." Lauren's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking toward the door as though searching for some escape that did not exist. "I only wanted what I believed I deserved," she said finally, her voice quiet and bitter. "I gave up my place among my own family's pack to come here, and Damon made promises to me that he never intended to keep once his interest began to fade." "That does not explain the poison," Elder Winifred said calmly. "It was never meant to be poison," Lauren snapped, some of her earlier composure cracking entirely under the pressure of the moment. "It was meant to be believable. Enough to convince the pack that Soraya had turned against me. Enough to remove her from Damon's side permanently, so that I could finally take the place I had been promised." "And Maggie?" Garrick asked quietly. "You were willing to threaten an innocent young woman's future to protect your own lie?" Lauren said nothing, her silence answer enough. "Where did you obtain the substance?" Elder Corbin asked again, his patience clearly thinning. "My cousin sent it to me," Lauren admitted finally, the last of her resistance crumbling under the weight of everything already exposed. "I wrote to her weeks ago, explaining my situation, asking for something that would help me secure my place here permanently. She did not know exactly what I intended to use it for. I told her only that I needed something to help with sleeplessness." The room fell silent for a long moment, as the elders absorbed the full weight of her confession, the careful, deliberate planning behind what had initially appeared to be a moment of panic and desperation. "This was not a single reckless decision," Elder Winifred said slowly. "This was planned over weeks, with intention to permanently harm another member of this pack's standing and freedom." Lauren said nothing further, her earlier defiance finally giving way to something closer to resignation, the full understanding of what she had done, and what consequences now awaited her, settling heavily over her features. Outside the chamber, word of the confession spread quickly through the hall, carried in whispers from those closest to the door to those seated further back, until the entire gathered pack understood, even before the elders formally returned, that the truth had finally been fully confirmed. Soraya, still standing near the front of the hall, felt the shift in the room's energy before she fully understood its cause. A subtle change in the murmurs around her. Glances now filled with something closer to sympathy and quiet respect, rather than lingering suspicion. Nora returned to stand near her, having left Maggie in the care of another sympathetic pack member, and offered a small, relieved smile. She confessed, Nora said quietly. Everything. The sedative, the plan, the threats against Maggie. Soraya closed her eyes briefly, the weight of days spent locked away finally beginning to lift in full, replaced by something more complicated than simple relief. A tangled mixture of vindication and lingering hurt over how quickly she had been condemned in the first place. When the elders returned to the hall a short while later, their expressions grave, Elder Corbin addressed the gathered pack with the same measured authority he had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. Lauren has confessed fully to staging the events of that night, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. The substance found on her goblet was deliberately obtained and deliberately used to create a false appearance of poisoning, with the explicit intention of placing blame on Soraya in order to secure her own position within this pack. A wave of reaction rippled through the crowd, gasps and murmurs mixing together into a low, steady hum that Elder Corbin allowed to run its course before continuing. She further confessed to threatening her own maid, Maggie, coercing her into providing false testimony against Soraya, under threat of losing her place within this pack entirely. He turned then towards Soraya, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. This council formally recognizes your innocence in this matter. You are free to leave these proceedings without further restriction, and this pack owes you an apology for the swiftness with which judgment was passed against you before proper investigation had taken place. Soraya inclined her head slightly, accepting the formal acknowledgement with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the entire ordeal, though the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily against her chest. Damon rose slowly from his seat, his expression carrying none of the composed authority he usually maintained before the pack. For a long moment, he simply stood there, silent, before finally speaking, his voice quieter than Soraya had heard it in a very long time. I owe you far more than this council's formal acknowledgement, he said, looking directly at her for the first time since the recess had begun. I owe you an apology that words alone cannot fully repay. The hall remained silent, every wolf present watching the exchange unfold, aware that whatever passed between the alpha and the woman he had so quickly condemned would shape the pack's understanding of both of them for a long time to come. The formal proceedings concluded shortly after Damon's quiet acknowledgement, but the true reckoning for Lauren had only just begun. The elders convened once more, this time without the presence of the wider pack, to determine the consequences she would face for her deliberate deception and the harm it had caused. Elder Corbin presided over the final judgment with the same measured gravity he had carried throughout the entire inquiry. Lauren, he said, once she had been brought before the council one final time, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, resigned quiet. Your actions were not born of a single moment of fear or panic. They were carefully planned over weeks, executed with full awareness of the harm they would cause, and defended through coercion and threats against another member of this pack who bore no responsibility for your ambitions. Lauren said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. This council formally strips you of any standing within this pack, Elder Corbin continued. You will be escorted beyond our territory by sunrise tomorrow, and you will not be permitted to return. Any further contact with pack members, including Damon, will be considered a violation of this ruling. The finality of his words settled over the room, and Lauren's shoulders sagged beneath their weight. Whatever plans she had once harbored for a future within the pack, now permanently extinguished by the truth she had tried so desperately to bury. As she was led away by two guards, she cast one final glance toward Damon, searching perhaps for some flicker of the affection he had once shown her so openly, but found only quiet, unreadable distance in his expression. Whatever connection had existed between them, however genuine or manufactured it might have been, had clearly ended the moment her deception came fully into the light. Soraya did not watch her leave. She had spent enough of the past days consumed by Lauren's presence in her life, and she found she had little interest in witnessing the final chapter of a story that had already caused her more than enough pain. Instead, she made her way quietly out of the hall, seeking the fresh evening air, after so many days confined within stone walls, both the cell that had held her prisoner and the crowded hall that had finally set her free. Nora followed close behind, matching her pace as they walked together toward the edge of the pack grounds, where the forest began its gradual climb toward the mountains beyond. "You handled all of this with more grace than most wolves could have managed," Nora said quietly. "I do not know that I would have remained so composed if our positions had been reversed." "I did not feel composed," Soraya admitted, allowing herself, for the first time since the ordeal began, to speak honestly about the fear and hurt she had carried throughout the entire experience. "I felt as though everything I had built within this pack over the years could be erased in a single evening, simply because someone else's tears carried more weight than my years of quiet service." "But it was not erased," Nora said gently. "The pack remembers who you are, Saria. This entire situation only reminded them of it more clearly." Soraya allowed herself a small, tired smile, grateful for the friendship that had remained steady throughout everything, even when so much else had felt uncertain. They walked together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stale confinement of the cell she had endured for days. It was there, near the edge of the forest, that Damon found her sometime later, having excused himself from the remaining formalities within the hall to seek her out directly. Nora, sensing the moment required privacy, offered a quiet nod of encouragement before stepping away, leaving the two of them alone beneath the darkening sky. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of everything unsaid stretching heavily between them. "I do not know where to begin," Damon said finally, his voice quieter and more uncertain than Soraya had heard it in a very long time. "I failed you in a way I am not certain I can ever fully repair. I condemned you without question, based on nothing more than tears and performance, when you had given me years of unwavering loyalty and trust." Soraya studied him carefully, searching for the wolf she had once known so completely, the one who had promised partnership and devotion beneath the old oak tree so many years ago. She found traces of him still present, buried beneath months of distance and neglect, but she was no longer certain those traces were enough to rebuild what had been so carelessly damaged. "You did fail me," she said honestly, refusing to soften the truth simply to ease his discomfort. "Not only in the moment of the accusation, but in the months before it, when you allowed distance to grow between us without ever addressing it, when you sought comfort elsewhere, instead of speaking honestly with me about whatever dissatisfaction you were carrying." Damon absorbed her words without argument, his expression heavy with genuine regret, rather than the practiced apology she might once have expected from him. "You are right," he said quietly. "I allowed comfort and flattery to distract me from the steady, quiet strength you offered every single day, because steady strength does not demand attention the way performance does. I mistook quiet loyalty for indifference, and I am deeply sorry for the pain that mistake caused you." Soraya said nothing for a long moment, allowing his words to settle honestly between them, rather than rushing to offer forgiveness she did not yet fully feel. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally. "But trust, once broken so completely, does not rebuild itself simply because the truth has finally been recognized. It will take more than words to restore what has been damaged between us, if it can be restored at all." Damon nodded slowly, accepting her honesty without protest. "Then I will spend whatever time is necessary proving myself worthy of that trust again, if you will allow me the chance to try." Soraya looked out toward the darkening forest, considering his words carefully, before finally speaking again. "I will not promise you an outcome I cannot yet see clearly," she said. "But I am willing to allow you the chance to show, through actions rather than words alone, whether the wolf I once trusted so completely still exists beneath everything that has happened." It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something, a small, fragile opening where none had existed only moments before. As the last light faded fully from the sky above the mountain, and Soraya turned and walked back toward the pack house, Freya settled quietly and contentedly within her, for the first time in many long, difficult days, the truth finally recognized, her dignity fully restored, and whatever came next, left open to unfold in its own careful time. Sunrise came clear and cold over the mountain the following morning, and true to the elder's judgment, Lauren was escorted beyond the boundaries of pack territory, before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline. Few gathered to witness her departure, and those who did watched in silence, offering neither cruelty nor sympathy, simply the quiet acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Lyria did not attend. She spent that morning instead in the quiet company of Nora and Maggie, the three of them sharing a simple breakfast in the warmth of the kitchen, a small gesture of gratitude toward the young maid whose courage, however delayed and however coerced into being, had ultimately helped bring the truth fully into the light. "I am sorry it took me so long to speak honestly," Maggie said quietly, still carrying traces of guilt despite everyone's assurances that she bore no true responsibility for what had happened. "You spoke honestly when it mattered most," Soraya said gently. "That is what matters, not the delay that came before it. Fear is a heavy thing to carry alone, and you carried it as long as you could before finally setting it down. There is no shame in that." Maggie's eyes softened with relief at the words, and for the first time since the entire ordeal began, a genuine, unguarded smile crossed her face. In the days that followed, the pack slowly settled back into its familiar rhythms, though the events of the inquiry left a lasting impression on nearly everyone who had witnessed them unfold. Warriors who had once hesitated to speak openly in Soraya's defense now greeted her with clear, unhesitating respect. Pack members who had allowed fear or uncertainty to keep them silent during the darkest days of her imprisonment made quiet efforts to offer their support, small gestures of kindness that, while unable to erase the pain of what had happened, helped steadily rebuild the sense of belonging she had feared losing entirely. Damon, true to his word, did not simply return to his previous habits once the immediate crisis had passed. He made deliberate efforts to include Soraya fully in council matters once more, seeking her counsel not out of obligation, but with genuine interest in her perspective and judgment. He spent evenings that had once been filled with idle distraction, instead sitting quietly beside her, listening more than he spoke, working patiently to rebuild the kind of steady, honest connection that had eroded so gradually over the preceding months. Soraya allowed this rebuilding to happen slowly, without rushing toward forgiveness she did not yet fully feel, and without closing herself off entirely to the possibility of restored trust. She had learned, through the difficult days of her imprisonment and the inquiry that followed, that dignity did not require haste, and that healing, much like justice, often arrived gradually rather than all at once. Old Garrick remained a quiet, steady presence throughout this period, occasionally checking in on her well-being with the same understated care he had shown from the very beginning. "You handled everything with more composure than most wolves twice your age could have managed," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together along the edge of the training grounds. "The pack remembers that. It will not be forgotten easily." "I could not have done it without those willing to look closely enough to find the truth," Soraya said. "Without your nose, and Ivy's careful attention, and Nora's persistence, and even Maggie's courage in the end, this might have ended very differently." Garrick nodded thoughtfully. Truth rarely surfaces on its own. It requires those willing to search for it honestly, even when it would be easier to simply accept the easier, more convenient story. You are fortunate to have people around you willing to do that searching. Soraya considered his words as they continued their walk, grateful not only for the truth that had ultimately been uncovered, but for the community that had proven, in the end, more willing to seek honesty than she had feared during those long, uncertain days in her cell. Several weeks later, as autumn began settling firmly over the mountain, Damon requested a quiet evening walk with Soraya, along the same path that led toward the old oak tree, where they had first exchanged their vows so many years earlier. She agreed, curious what prompted the request, though she suspected she already understood its purpose. They stood together beneath the ancient branches, the tree's leaves beginning their slow transformation into deep autumn colors, the same steady presence it had offered on the night of their original bonding. "I do not expect you to trust me fully again simply because time has passed," Damon said quietly, "but I wanted you to know that everything I have done these past weeks has come from genuine effort, not obligation. I understand now, more clearly than I ever have, the value of what I nearly lost through my own carelessness." Soraya studied him carefully in the fading evening light, searching honestly within herself for whatever answer felt true, rather than simply convenient or expected. "I see the effort," she said finally, "and I recognize it as sincere. Trust is rebuilding slowly, Damon. More slowly than either of us might wish, but it is rebuilding nonetheless." A quiet, genuine relief crossed his features, though he did not push for more than what she had offered, understanding perhaps for the first time the value of patience over urgency. "That is enough," he said softly. "For now, that is more than enough." They stood together beneath the old oak tree, as the last light of evening faded fully into the deep blue of coming night, the mountains settling into peaceful quiet around them. Soraya felt Freya stir contentedly within her. The long shadow of injustice finally lifted, replaced by something steadier and more hopeful than she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The pack had witnessed her strength, her dignity, and the truth that ultimately vindicated her, and though the road toward fully restored trust between her and Damon remained long and uncertain, she walked it now, not from fear or desperation, but from her own steady, deliberate choice, exactly as she had faced every difficult moment throughout the entire ordeal. Whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she always had, with quiet strength, unwavering honesty, and the steady certainty that truth, however delayed, always found its way into the light.